Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's Film Studies Online discussion brought to you by Bryn Mawr Film Institute. My name is Andrew Douglas. I am Senior Director of Education and Administration at BMFI, and I am thrilled to be joined by one of our wonderful instructors, Paul Wright. Paul, how are you tonight?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, and thank you for suggesting we include this film in our discussion series, and thank you so much for your outstanding introduction.
Thank you.
It's really, you know, you, you cover a lot of interesting film and media topics for us, but having your literary background be able to enrich our understanding of a film that clearly has so many allegorical elements we're really fortunate that we have you for this discussion. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
Everybody, in case you are new, let me go over the sort of ground rules again. Please keep yourselves, your audio on mute. I will call on you to ask your question or make your comment. And I will try to get to everyone. I may not be able to get to people a second time around if they've already made a comment, depending on how long things go, but I will try to get to everybody at least once. The way I will know to call on you is you can use the raise hand function as shown on your screen right now. Please use that, raise your hand. I will, when I call on you, ask your question or make your comment, and then please go back on mute so Paul and or I can respond to it, and we will go from there. In addition, we have the chat function working, and we would love for you all to please introduce yourselves in there if you're new to the discussion or are from outside the greater Philadelphia area, and you can also talk amongst yourselves in there as well. And finally, if you are from really far outside of our area, or you would like to give us a bit of information about how you found us from wherever you are, please visit the Where in the World form in the Film Studies Online section of brynmawrfilm.org, and we would love to hear more about how you found us and what you think of our discussions. So let's get to tonight's discussion of Snowpiercer. And we have, I see, our regular duo starting us off. Let's begin with David. David, good evening.
Good evening. And Paul, I would just want to add first to the accolade that Andrew just provided. When we got done listening, we realized how many things we didn't even know that you started to discuss.
Oh, thank you.
The items that I'm going to throw out here as opening thoughts, among the many, I saw some reminiscence of Les Miserables and some of the scenes that were there from the back to the front. Instead of the barrier, it was the battering ram. Mm-hmm. And instead of the one dying scene, we had Tanya dying and Curtis promising to find her child. Many of you on the call know I've talked about music from time to time, and the tension that the music kept bringing was just perfect. I mean, when I was aware of the music, it was always right there. And I don't know whether your selection of the movie was because you knew the snowstorm was coming.
We were joking about that earlier.
You guys have a whole bunch of different reasons for selecting. Sometimes it's just because it's such a favorite of yours. And we also thought a little bit, and we haven't gotten this into a cohesive single thought, about some of the issues of the front and the back and how things are going in the last 10, 11 months in the pandemic with uneven treatment. And, some people live at the front of the train, many of us on this call perhaps. And you might want to comment on any or a few of those things, but thank you so much. This is an amazing film. I think I could watch it 10 times and still learn more.
Well, thanks for those comments and prompts, David. Paul, did you have any thoughts in response to what David brought up?
I think he hit the nail on the head with his observations about the clear parallels we're meant to draw between class disparities on the train and class disparities in the world we live in. I was originally drawn to the film as a way of using pop culture to help explain some other concepts. I was asked to give a lecture in Shanghai on income inequality and Thomas Piketty's book on income inequality. But I was also asked to weave in film and television and pop culture examples of that. And I had just seen this film before going to Shanghai, so I instantly decided to draw it into the discussion. And I think you're right to find the analogs to other films and stories. Think too of Eisenstein's movies about revolution. There are echoes here and there of those. And it's just a film that isn't afraid, as I said in the remarks online, it's a film that isn't afraid to be an allegory, even though allegory has fallen out of favor by and large in the modern world.
And I thought your reference to Les Miserables was a very interesting one. And of course, I have to believe that despite the fact that that is set at a very particular historical moment and is in many ways specifically related to that moment, it too clearly has its allegorical elements, or opportunities might be a better way to say it. I have to believe that to be the case, if only because I can't believe something solely about the French Revolution would run on Broadway for that long. It had to have a broader reach than that. I mean, it had wonderful music, but it had to have a broader reach than that as well. Joss, do you have a question or comment?
Yes, I do. First of all, I want to echo David's thanks to Paul for a wonderful, insightful, informative introduction that just would not have come to my attention. The issues would not have come to my attention without it. So thank you once again. I think this is a wonderful film. I had seen the title pop up on various streaming services, and I said, another stupid summer comic book movie. And then I saw Parasite and looked for other work and saw that Snowpiercer was among the other work. And well, now I have to see this movie. And I'm so glad that I did. And I know there will be, I expect there will be discussion of Parasite and Snowpiercer later on. But I want to bring up something else. I wondered if John Hurt's character, Gilliam, was a nod to Terry Gilliam, one of the Monty Pythons and the one responsible for their their animated visual style, and a filmmaker in his own right. And in particular, his visual style and his own dystopian future. I'm talking about his movie Brazil, which in many ways was similar in that there was nothing terribly realistic about Snowpiercer. I mean, it was just, the performances were great, the setting was great, but it was totally unbelievable, and it doesn't matter. And that's a lot of Terry Gilliam's work is like that. He even had a similar visual style to 12 Monkeys. So I just wondered, Andrew or Paul, any thoughts about those references, if you think they're there?
I think they clearly are. Paul,
I agree. I agree.
Yeah, I mean, Joss, you did a nice job of pointing out the two biggest parallels or points of comparison, I should say, in Gilliam's filmography, namely Brazil. And a number of reviews when this movie came out compared this movie to that one. And 12 Monkeys as well. The style very much, the look of it, the environment, the seeming futility of trying to change one's station or play a different role than one has been assigned is similar there as well. And as I read more about this movie, I was reminded as well that unfortunately, well, I shouldn't say unfortunately, but Brazil was exposed to the same challenging release, theatrical release that this movie was, although it was ultimately escaped. Namely that if you watch this movie, particularly if you watch this movie in any format, but if you watch it on Blu-ray as I did, you saw the Weinstein Company credits at the beginning, and they are famous for wanting to have, ironically for a movie like this, wanting to be able to completely control the destiny of a film and determine exactly what role it will play in their larger film release universe. And they had all sorts of ideas for changes that should be made to this film before its US release, and luckily none of them were made to come to pass. So we're seeing it as the director had intended. That's my understanding anyway. Paul, is that yours as well?
Totally. I don't think there are any accidents in the naming with Bong Joon-ho. He was particularly gracious towards Martin Scorsese when he won his Oscar. He's also been gracious towards Quentin Tarantino, who was an early champion of his films. And I guarantee you he knows Terry Gilliam's movies and was surely inspired by them here. Andrew might have been alluding to this, I'm not sure, but in the original release of Brazil, right, it was not only an argument about how long the film should be, so there are different lengths of cuts of Brazil, but there was even a happy ever after ending tacked on to one version of Brazil that got shown on television for many years. I saw it. It's an utter travesty, a betrayal of the rest of that movie. And I'm just glad that Snowpiercer never had to undergo not only cuts, right, but also the kind of changes that would have somehow made the film more optimistic than it deserved to be. And the last thing I would connect to Gilliam here is thematic. And what's so brilliant in Brazil and also in Snowpiercer is that it doesn't just talk about the oppression of people, but it talks about how that oppression is normalized and how it's rationalized and how you're told it's all part of the natural order of things. So when Jonathan Pryce's character in Brazil gets in trouble for hiring a non-sanctioned worker to fix his air ducts, right? This drags him into an entire revolution and conspiracy against a dystopian state. And it's a reminder that, right, for most people living under a dystopian nightmare state, they're just told to grin and bear it, and that this is the way it ought to be. And we get the exact same message from the people in the upper cars in Snowpiercer. It's not just that we are better than you, more equipped than you, have advantages you don't have, but that's the way the world wants it. That's the way the engine wants it. That's the way Wilford wants it, who basically plays a kind of god in that regard.
And indeed that situation can't change, but also that it's essential to the functioning of the society, right? That everybody has their part. You know, the world needs, cannon fodder too, I guess, is in sort of the mentality there. And that's one of that mentality has probably done more injustice and harm to more people than, or as much as any other, let's put it that way. Let's see. Ben, you have a question or comment.
I did. Well, first of all, I just want to say I really love this movie. I think it's great. And it obviously is saying a lot about class. And I was just wondering how you think the ending of the film factors into that, in that do you think it's saying something about how these societies with these types of class systems and big wealth inequalities, how they end? Specifically, I mean, everybody, or at least almost everybody, dying in the end. Do you think that is saying something that's on purpose or just a part of the story?
Well, I think you're onto something. I mean, on one level, it can be saying that class conflict will do us all in eventually, right? And it's even implied in the backstory of the film that our inability to get along and be good caretakers and stewards of the planet and one another led to the global crisis in the first place that turned the Snowpiercer from just a kind of gimmicky train, which is all it was, people thought at first, into, the last arc carrying the remnants of the human species. So the idea that class conflict will eventually consume everyone unless otherwise dealt with is, I think, a real theme of the movie. I think the film is also doing a couple of interesting things with traditional kind of leftist ideas of revolution. So on the one hand, John Hurt's Gilliam character, not only is he, I think, named after Terry Gilliam, but he sure looks like Trotsky to me. And so you have a lot of echoes of past revolutions in the iconography, the costuming of the film, et cetera. But what I thought was fascinating was when you get to Ed Harris's Wilford at the end, he admits that he and Gilliam had been working together all along, that periodically they would foment a revolution just to put it down, which was a way of controlling population on the plane. So kind of echoes of Malthus there, demographics and population, but also a way of reinforcing the overall power and control on the train in Wilford's hands. And this is less an echo of Karl Marx and more an echo of Michel Foucault, because Foucault talks an awful lot in his writings about power being so powerful precisely because it knows when to encourage resistance to it. It creates opportunities for resistance so it can then crush that resistance and reinscribe power even more deeply than it already was. And that certainly is part of what Wilford was up to on that train.
That's really interesting. Thank you. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead. That's fine. I also think that the story, you know, it's about all those things. It's also about hubris, right? The world, the earth gets into the mess it gets into because, you know, somebody, some group of people, some group of countries is convinced that they can basically calibrate perfectly or within reason, close to perfectly, the total atmosphere and the overall temperature of an entire planet. Which the idea that could be, the thought that could be done tells you something, but also the hubris of Wilford, and to that extent to, you know, Gilliam, that they could, I mean, what they did worked for a while, but in the grand scheme of a civilization, you know, 17 years or whatever it was isn't all that long. And the notion that they could sort of calibrate the human spirit through their give and take and their intentional, their you know, their release valves of revolution, was, you know, was doomed to fail. And I think one thing the ending tells us is that something we've heard before, particularly in science fiction, and I always think of the many lessons taught to us by Steven Spielberg. One of them, biggest ones, is in Jurassic Park: nature will out, right? And when we see that polar bear at the end, that is certainly a hopeful sign, although I'm sure if he sees those two people, he's thinking lunch, but that's another story for another day. But the point is that the idea that even your most human's most botched experiment or effort, that appeared to exterminate nearly everything, ultimately can't even do that. There are forces greater than the people, no matter how much they think they are equal to those forces within their microcosm of the train, they ultimately aren't.
And isn't it ironic, Andrew, that Wilford says, if we were in different circumstances, we could afford to wait for evolution here and other sort of natural processes.
Natural selection, yeah.
Natural selection. But we can't afford to do that. And so what does he do? He embarks on a plan that nearly wipes everyone out anyway, right?
Right.
So it's kind of absurd that he thinks he is, you know, this is where the God complex of the scientist or the engineer comes in, right? He thinks he can play God. He thinks he can control natural selection. And this is on the heels of the planet already thinking it could control the climate.
Right. Marcia, you have a question or comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask if you could comment at all on, and I'm sorry I'm blanking on her name, the woman who was sort of, you know, his right-hand person.
Mr. Mason, Tilda Swinton.
With the one with the very bad dental work.
Yes.
Yes.
I didn't know quite what to make of how exaggerated she was, and I just wondered if you had any comments about her character.
Okay, thanks for that, Marcia. Paul, did you have any thoughts?
Just a few. Tilda Swinton is such a great actor, and one thing I love about her is she will throw herself into a role and glamour be damned. She doesn't care how she looks if it works for the part. And so she was the one who insisted on making the character look even more grotesque, sort of upping the ante on the dental work and everything else. And one of the influences she had in mind, besides other famous tyrants in history, and I'm not saying this person is an outright tyrant, but this was someone she said she had in mind, was Margaret Thatcher. So she is looking, right, for these historical analogs to the character she's playing. In this case, a kind of, second banana facilitator, toady to Wilford. Apparently in one of the backstories, it's revealed that he had slept with her at some point, as well as other people on the train. But at any rate, whatever the source of that relationship, right, she is the spokesperson. And she's the one who, in that amazing speech, when we first meet her early on in the film, when they basically expose that arm of that passenger to the elements and then they hack it off, she gives the speech about knowing your place in the natural order, right? You need to be a shoe. If you're not a hat, stop pretending you are a hat and just do your duty and be underfoot. So she's a fascinating character and very over the top, but I think one of the early commenters had it right in that this is a film that isn't, I think it's very realistic in the sense that it deals with very real issues that we ought to pay attention to. So I think it's very much grounded in our world, but the style of it, right, is not realistic in our usual way. And the characterization, including Mason, is very consciously over the top.
And I think that there's, she is giving a performance and depicting a character that I don't know how much this came from the direction, from the screenplay, or from her perception of the character, but this is sort of, this person in a way has to be the supreme sycophant, right? The supreme apparatchik for the, purposes, goals, needs, and in her mind, glorification of Wilford. It was funny, right? Because when we finally meet Wilford, it's not at all evident to me that he's the sort, unlike some people, who need that sort of and demand that sort of glorification. He doesn't seem to crave it or demand it, and certainly doesn't.
Or he's burned out on it, possibly, after all these years.
Right, that's true too. But regardless, there are always people who think people in those positions want that sort of glorification, whether they do want it, ask for it, whatever. And she's clearly one of those people. She knows from her role how bad things are the further back you get in the train, and she has committed herself to making sure she is absolutely so essential that she will never be forced to experience it firsthand. And so she, whatever, that's her sacrifice, right? That's her commitment, her show of commitment to Wilford and to the cause, and she embraces it with what she imagines a man in his position would want from someone in her position, even though, as Paul said, maybe he's long since grown tired of that. Dana, you have a question or comment?
Hi there. I want to say one thing about Tilda Swinton first before I get to my point. I read that she loved working with Bong and did another film, at least another one with him, the one about the girl and the pig. I forget what it's called, but it was terrific. Yeah, Ocha. But she said it in an interview that she likes the fact that Bong works with his editor, and she was sort of part of those conversations. So she sort of knew the extent that her character could go. And therefore, I think she added a lot of hilarity to the movie. I think she sort of was over the top funny. She cracked me up.
Absolutely.
Because I think she knew how far she could take the character and be a little crazy and wild, and she was sort of out of the boundaries of a lot of it because she knew how far she could go and not ruin what the scenes were doing. And I think that, he must have given her a lot of leeway so she could take those chances, which is another reason why I just, like when she pulled out the teeth, it was just fabulous. But the question that I have is about, Paul, your description of allegory, I just thought was just outstanding. It was about the best explanation I could imagine. And one of the things that you said, which I really thought about in this movie, was that in order for the allegory to work, the linear story has to work. And I have a question about that. You sort of indicated that you thought that this one really does work, and therefore the allegory levels do. I have a question though about the linear version. There were two things that troubled me. One was the Gilliam character. I'm not really sure how he fits into the allegory. And the other is the ending, where the train, literally the children go off the rails and they leave the train. And it kind of felt to me like, is that the ending that this allegory should have had? And if it is, I'd be curious to know what you see the allegory as in this movie. Okay.
So two things there. One on the literal level, right? The literal level has to work, or otherwise the allegory fails. Because you can have all the messages you want, but if you're not drawn into a compelling story about recognizable people, even over the top people like Tilda Swinton, then the whole thing falls apart. So one of your questions, I think, was about Gilliam. If you're asking what I think allegorically he represents, I would say something like a corrupted idealism, because at some point in the story, and I'm extrapolating here, but at some point in the story, I assume he believed what he said. And I assume that he did want better for the people in the tail section. And we do find out from Chris Evans' character, from Curtis, that when Curtis was part of the marauding bands who were ready to eat babies, that's how bad it had gotten, right? It was Gilliam who basically, hacked off his own arm and said, this is not how we ought to live. And if you want to eat somebody, eat my arm. So I don't think that was fake, actually. But at some point in those 17 years, Gilliam maybe fell in love with his own cult of personality and image, started communicating with Wilford, and all of a sudden their very demonic pact was formed. And Gilliam went from being an idealist who was by no means flawless, but at least had the courage of his convictions, to being someone who really was playing everyone on that train up to and including Curtis up to the bitter end. So I think, corrupted ideals, he definitely stands in for that. And if you think of the Trotskyite look of the character and think of how ugly things got with the Russian Revolution and how idealism morphed into a different kind of tyranny, not the czars, but a different kind, then you see a message of the film there. As far as the ending goes, if you wanted to kind of honor the bleakness of the whole story, maybe nobody should have gotten off the train. Someone had noted in the chat that the white males in power of one kind or another, like Curtis and Wilford, don't survive, but two young people who are not white do survive. What does that mean? Not sure. The fact that they're young, the fact that they may have hope and optimism is great. But by the same token, as Andrew pointed out, they're in the middle of a frigid winter still, and a polar bear is eyeing them for lunch. So I'm not sure how optimistic we're supposed to take the ending. Whether you think it's a fitting ending or not is, I guess, a fair question.
I mean, to me, Gilliam, I completely, accept or support Paul's reading of it, and his understanding of allegory is richer than mine. But I think that I think for this really to represent a microcosm of human civilization, or to have figures that represent elements of human nature, you need to have the person who is either the compromiser or the appeaser, depending on how you look at it. And as bad as things were at the back of that train when we got there, when the story starts and we enter into it, they could still be much worse.
And they had been worse.
And they had been worse. And I don't think it's any coincidence that we hear from Curtis that it's about a month after Gilliam gives up his arm that the protein bars start showing up. And one can imagine that the protein bars were the first sort of, I don't know Latin, quid pro quo element on Wilford's side for Gilliam's, cooperation with him. And you could also imagine the notion that there are different views of what quality of life is worth living. There are some people who would say, and we know this from the world, there are some people who would say being alive under any circumstances is absolutely worth it. And Gilliam could have, in his own way, been trying to keep as many people, or the descendants of as many people, from the back of the train alive as possible. And that came with a very high price. I mean, we don't know, but all those sort of potential interpretations are there, and I think it's important because those are present and sometimes powerful kind of drives in individuals as well as within cultures.
To Andrew's excellent point there, my imagination of the tale is that initially Gilliam and Wilford got on the horn and spoke to negotiate, right? And maybe one of those negotiations, right, was the protein bars. But over time, they actually formed this bizarre comradeship, perhaps because each is the leader on his end of the train and no one else knows what it's like to be the leader on their end of the train. And all of a sudden they start having these long drawn out conversations. Ed Harris tells us at the end, right, that Gilliam could go on for hours about anything. So, which raises the question of why Wilford stayed on with him all that time if he did not himself need an interlocutor, right? Because neither of them probably felt in a certain way free to speak their minds except to the other. And so I don't know if I should call it friendship, but something was going on there between them that facilitated, years of collaboration.
Well, and think about this. Imagine if Curtis accepts Wilford's offer and becomes the new engineer, leader of the train. And suppose then he is able to forget being as just and as ethical as he becomes after Gilliam gives him his arm and he realizes the horror of what he was. Imagine he's only half as bad as Wilford was. Then would Gilliam's dealings with Wilford for those many years have been worth it? Mm-hmm. What improvement in the standard of living for the people in the back of the train that Curtis might have allowed, encouraged, made possible, even if he gets corrupted by the wealth and comfort up front, or even if he keeps making sacrifices from the back because certain sacrifices are necessary for the whole train to even keep going. But what if
the
it's
question
better?
Is who would have arisen to take Gilliam's place in the rear, right? He would have had a new counterpart to deal with at some point.
Yeah. Steve, you have a question or comment? No. Okay. I think that we don't currently have any hands raised, so we can certainly, I would encourage people to put their hands up if they have questions or comments. There we go. Kathleen, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the end. I was surprised that Curtis died at the end.
I'm back up again, sorry.
Okay, we can certainly talk about that. I mean, it seems to me that if we think about the larger issues that the film is dealing with, I'm not surprised by Curtis's death. But Paul, what are your thoughts on that?
I agree with you. Just as we said earlier, having the children be the survivors, it's a very Whitney Houston moment, right? The children are our future. We just don't know if they can lead the way, right? Because things are just so horrible. But given Curtis's moral complexity as a character, the weight of his own history and past actions, there seems to be a kind of willingness on his part to die for a good cause at last, and to sacrifice his arm, right? Because he has to in order to get that one kid out of the engine. I believe it's Octavia Spencer's son. So I wasn't surprised that he died. I also mentioned this, I think, in my video. I love Chris Evans' performance in this film. I think it's one of the best things he's ever done. And at first, when I saw that he was in the movie, I was a little annoyed. I'm like, oh, come on, it's way too on the nose to bring Captain America in here. And he's already kind of acting like Captain America. He's in charge, he's a leader, he gets things done. He's our hero, right? And then to hear the story of what he went through and what he did, right? That he had not only known the taste of human flesh, but also of baby flesh. That really, turns on its head all the expectations we had about character in the film, when even the guy we're trained to identify with the most, the protagonist, turns out not only to have feet of clay, but to have real, literally skeletons in his closet. And the way he talks about all of that, the moral toll, the psychological toll that all took on him, is just really profoundly moving. And I think he gives a terrific performance. And from that point of view, I feel like he did have to die. It was that kind of situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this film deals with very many topics, but I think one, and Paul and I were talking about this a bit before the chat started, has to do with parenthood, right? It's no coincidence in the film, I can't believe, that there are so many parent-child ties, both sort of explicit, literal, and figurative, right? There's, we learned that Curtis basically was going to eat the Jamie Bell character, and then obviously feels a sort of big brother or fatherly obligation to him. Gilliam clearly feels a father-like relationship to Curtis. Then there is the two people who are frozen and not frozen, who are released from their from incarceration, right? From their morgue drawer jail cell, and so, and then of course the things that happens with the kids being taken. And I just want to add as an aside, when I saw what those kids were being made to do, it was so much not as bad as what I was afraid of. It could have been so, I know it was terrible, but I was thinking such worse things. And I think so anyway, so the kids survive at the end. Why did the kids survive at the end? Because the girl's father and Curtis, who has told the boy's mother he will find him, give themselves up. They sacrifice themselves by shielding them from the blast so they can live. And that is, that is one of the things parents are supposed to do, not shield their kids from a blast, but give of themselves so their children may live better, may have opportunities, what have you. And in a sense, this film isn't just about parents and children in that way. It's about generations of humanity, right? And the obligation that we should all feel some obligation to those that come after us.
I love that point, Andrew, because even among the people who are in power on the train, who are very morally compromised, right? No doubt about it. But even among them, you see a desire to continue nurturing children. They have that whole school car led by a teacher who would have fit in a Leni Riefenstahl film. And the things they're teaching the children are total propaganda and indoctrination. But at least the notion, right, that the children matter and that you have to care for them, educate them, nurture them, that's something everyone on the train actually has in common by and large. And I think you're right. There are all kinds of literal and also figurative parent-child relationships established throughout.
Thank you for saying what I was trying to say more eloquently.
Loved it.
Steve, your question or comment?
Okay, actually, it's Marcia Stevens' wife.
Oh, Marcia, go ahead, please.
Sure. I work for Lower Merion Township, and we have several copies of the DVD with the second disc, which I thought was really interesting. It has things like the birth of Snowpiercer from the original graphic novel through from the 1980s through the present when this movie was done. It has the artists, the illustrator, everything was involved. And also, just so you know, originally Mason was supposed to be a man, according to what they said in
That's
this.
right. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
thought was really interesting.
John C. Riley was in the running for the part. I think.
Yeah, wasn't it fascinating that, by the way, Paul, your introduction was really quite amazing. It shows what a good, strong academic liberal arts education can really produce.
Oh, thank you.
We really appreciate that. It's interesting that this movie, which is Snowpiercer, which came out in 2014, wasn't really recognized, that I could say, by the Academy Awards, and yet it was in English. And here was a subtitle movie that came out in 2019, where he was Parasite, which came out, and he won the Academy Award for it. So I guess his talent was recognized, and then he was able to build on it with Parasite. I just wonder what your comments were on that, or your thoughts were.
Well, while Snowpiercer did make a lot of critics' top 10 lists, if you check that out, critics did appreciate it. But you're right, it didn't get Oscar love. It was a financial success for sure, but didn't get Oscar love. And I think that has as much or more to do with not only Bong Joon-ho being from Korea, right? And there are questions there about name brand recognition, race, you name it. But also genre plays a big part, right? Genre films always struggle. And it doesn't matter sometimes how good they are, right? They don't get that recognition. And I think this is a film that has only grown in stature in the years since its release. And of course, Parasite helps it grow in stature.
Sure.
No question about it. And if you were thinking about those two films side by side, that's exactly what I wanted you to do, because I think these are two films that speak to one another, even though they come from totally different genre standpoints.
And the last point, which was interesting, Bong Joon would have had more people live, but he didn't have enough money to support that, to continue the movie. He was interviewed
on these discs. Yeah.
There is a Snowpiercer TV series now, which I haven't seen yet, and apparently takes its own, it's its own take on the material.
I think it's interesting too, because we heard Joss say at the beginning of the discussion that when he first became aware of this film, he thought, oh, it's a summer blockbuster type of thing. And that just speaks to what you were saying, Paul, about genre. The idea that, certain movies are worthy of serious critical consideration and certain movies aren't. I sometimes look at it the other way. And I say, how many people saw a cool sci-fi movie set on a train that never stops, and it got them to see their first film by a Korean filmmaker?
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, it cuts both ways. So at least there's that. Robert, you have a question or comment?
Yes. I want to say two things. The first is an observation, and the second is a question. The observation is, I just feel that the racial issues here are looming and are so obvious. I mean, the two evil people, Guilford and Gilliam, were white people. Mason was a white woman who was more like a Nazi concentration guard, and and that teacher who was teaching and brainwashing the children was a white. The people who survive at the end are not white. So in the end, we have a start of a new civilization there'll be no white people left. I just can't escape that. And I don't remember seeing any non-white people among the Nazi stormtroopers, so to speak. Anyway, it seems like, anyway, my question is, I saw what that lady just said, that second disc where they had interviews, and somebody said how incredible Bong, the director, is, because he knew exactly what he wanted, and he only shot what he wanted to see on the film, and that there was hardly any editing at all. And so I was wondering if you guys would want to comment on how do you do that, and how did he use like different lenses? Anyway, thank you.
Andrew, you want to tackle that one?
Sure. to the first point, and Paul, I hope I have some more comment on this regarding the whiteness versus people of color and other races. I think that you know, I think that film's a visual medium. You have a limited amount of time to communicate a lot, and ideally you'll communicate it visually. And there's obviously an extent to which in this movie, some people would say outside of this movie and in the larger world and in many unfortunate circumstances, white is seen as a representation of power, authority, privilege, what have you. And I certainly wouldn't fault a filmmaker, certainly not a filmmaker making an allegory, creating an allegory, to use that visual shorthand in trying to communicate part of his point. And I think that's probably not unintentional. Regarding your point about editing, yes, I didn't see those interviews, but assuming what you said was that Bong, in part to save money, because this was, I think, at the time, one of, if not the most expensive South Korean production ever made. He basically did what's called editing in camera, which is when a filmmaker, with the help of the screenplay and storyboard artists, and perhaps, I don't know the extent to which Bong is involved in creating his own storyboards or not, but based on those, with those elements as source material, only shoots very little footage that won't be needed. I don't think it's not exactly fair to say the film then doesn't require any editing, because the choices of which takes to use and when to transition and what kind of transition and on are still very important decisions made during the editing process. But the fact that there wasn't a lot of extraneous footage is something that is very advantageous to filmmakers, but is something that not nearly every filmmaker can do. Alfred Hitchcock could do it. He developed the skill, the ability to do this very early on, because when he was working first in the British and then the American studio systems, he wasn't interested in anyone else being able to take his movie from him and edit it differently. If you only shoot the shots that you can envision using, then there's not really a lot of opportunity for someone else to change much of anything by editing it differently. A lesson perhaps Orson Welles would have been well served to learn. Martin Scorsese is said to be able to edit in camera as well, and it's not surprising if one knows his encyclopedic knowledge of film history and the way how much he thinks visually. I wouldn't be surprised if Steven Spielberg could do it, but I'm sure it's been, over 40 years since anyone's even thought about taking a movie from him, so it's probably moot at this point. But that's basically what that means, that based on, notions of continuity and film language, in order for the film to make any sense to an audience, you leave very little option based on the shots you have captured, very little option for it to be edited together in a way other than a way that will communicate your meaning, your take on the material, your view of the characters, et cetera, et cetera. Paul.
Andrew really explicated the editing process perfectly there. The only thing I would add is something I believe one of the other commenters mentioned earlier, which is that for a number of the actors, even though there was a language barrier and they had to get past that with Bong, they were really delighted to work for him and really felt he was an actor's director. And one of the reasons for that someone had commented earlier is they were allowed basically to participate in a little on-the-fly editing themselves as actors. So they could be there looking at the footage with the director and give their input, welcome input to what, framing, et cetera, he would want to keep from the footage. So I think that's a really powerful way of making your actors co-editors, at least in a small sense. And then on the question of whiteness, I think Robert's was the original observation on that. And I agree. I mean, it's hard to argue the racial iconography of this allegory and the way it turns out. I did notice some people of color among the soldiers trying to keep the people on the tail section down, but they're few and far between. And the people who are clearly in charge, the people who are in the hierarchy on this train, all speak to a certain kind of whiteness. And even the guy who's kind of hunting them down, the guy Franco, is played, I believe, by a Bosnian. And I forget his name off the top of my head. But at any rate, there's this effort, right, to pit white antagonists against non-white protagonists, with the exception, of Curtis. So I think it's hard to argue, with what Robert said.
Arlene, you have a question or comment?
Yes. Looking at this film made me think about the 1927 silent film by Fritz Lang, Metropolis.
Mm-hmm.
And I also became very interested in how many dystopian society films that I may have seen and how I related to them. And I wonder if you would like to comment about any of those things.
Arlene, I am so glad you brought up Metropolis, because as I said to Paul, I hadn't seen the movie, I hadn't seen Snowpiercer in many years until I watched it again for our discussion, and that's what hit me immediately. In those intervening years, I've taught Metropolis a few times at the Institute, and we've shown it there. And it's a film that is so influential, and it brings to mind another interesting, I'm sure coincidence, but an interesting one, which is, I believe, the graphic novel on which, the original graphic novel on which Snowpiercer is based, came out in 1982, which is the year that Blade Runner, another film even more greatly influenced by Metropolis, came out as well. So that's another one, right? Blade Runner is another prime example of a dystopian future in the science fiction genre, and it's a very frequent vision or version of the future. It's an unpleasant one, and of course it is very effective. You talk about, I don't know if I would go so far as to call many of these science fiction films necessarily allegories, but they're certainly myths in the structural sense, that they present some sort of binary opposition that allows us to see what perhaps a current divergence or conflict or schism in our society might look like if it is taken to extremes over the many years moving into the future. And that's one of the fascinating things, one of the great opportunities of the science fiction genre. And I think part of the reason why there have been so many smart and impactful dystopian films that have become members of that genre.
Andrew explained that really well, because if you take existing social conflicts and structures and you do a kind of extrapolation from our moment into the future, that's when it gets interesting, right? It's not just the conflict we have now, but how that conflict metastasizes, almost like cancer. And I love the mentions here of Metropolis and Blade Runner. And all I would say is those two movies plus Snowpiercer are reminders that doing dystopia is not easy. Doing it well is not easy. You might think it's easy, right? Because all you have to do is show everything, pardon my language, going to shit. I mean, that's all you show, right? And then you have your dystopia. But frankly, it's hard to do artfully. It's hard to do well. It's hard to do in a way that doesn't feel allegorical in the bad sense, right? That it's just a message movie. And the best movies, the ones we're talking about, those three, they don't feel that way, right? They work as stories on their own, and they also have something to say.
Okay, I'd like also to mention a little known or little talked about animated film called Fantastic Planet, which also said to me some of these things.
Well, thank you, Arlene. I'm not familiar with that one. Paul, are you?
It's called Fantastic Planet?
I think that's what she said, yes. Yeah, Fantastic Planet is what she said.
No, I don't know that one. I'll have to check it out.
Thank you for that suggestion, Arlene. Yeah, I mean, what Paul said is right. It's not easy to do these things well, and it's not easy to do these things in a way that, you know, as Paul was said in his introduction and again tonight, that the story is structured so well that you feel like you're being told the story. You don't feel like you're being lectured to, or you don't feel like you're being given a sort of a warning shot, right? And I didn't feel that way watching this film, yet still afterwards, if this movie doesn't at least give you occasion to think a little bit about, boy, I really wonder, what is going to come of dealing with climate change, and whether people will, will have some modicum of humility when trying to do something as enormous as change the Earth's atmosphere, or whether people will think when they say to themselves, certain people are better at certain things, what does that say to someone, and what lasting impact could that have on an individual, if one goes through life with that sort of mentality, even if they mean it in the most constructive way, because the people in this movie meant it in a constructive way. But we saw that even the best of intentions obviously can go horribly, horribly wrong.
And Andrew, that's where having Chris Evans have the dark past that he does really matters. Because if he just got to the front of that train and was still Captain America, all of a sudden you feel lectured to, right? But
right.
You don't after the revelations about who he is, and you see the moral compromise on all sides.
Right. But and the other thing that I thought was interesting, and I was a little, in a way, I was surprised before that reveal. I was surprised that this movie that I thought was appearing to have the sort of view of whiteness that, Robert and others have talked about it appearing to have tonight. I thought it was odd that he was chosen for that part. But then when you realize at the end of the film that his being there is in some way, at least, the work of not just Gilliam, but also Wilford, it makes total sense, right? Wilford's not going to hand over the reins of his train to someone he thinks is unworthy or an undesirable. Mm-hmm. So there have to be some of those Captain America qualities, at least on the outside, for it to be credible that Wilford would say, I think I can have this person succeed me.
Right.
So it's very interesting. Jordan, you have a question or comment?
Yes, I wonder if you could talk about the moment in the film where Curtis has to make a decision to either try to save his number two, his best friend, I guess, and he lets him go and get killed in order to capture Tilda Swinton, and if you have anything to say about that scene and that decision. I also wanted to just mention briefly, I thought that Ed Harris, there was a lot of the man behind the curtain from The Wizard of Oz to me, going through that train and waiting to see the man behind the curtain. Mm-hmm. I also thought the violinist, the man, that was very evocative to me of the Jews during the Holocaust who played in the orchestras at the concentration camps. Yep. And in talking about the kids at the end, where you thought that it wasn't as bad as you were thinking about, and to me they were literally cogs in the wheel, cogs in the machine, and on a literal basis and I guess allegorical basis. Mm-hmm. Anyway, yeah. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jordan. Yes. Boy, I'm getting old. I've already forgotten what his first point was. Paul, do you remember? Can you help?
My first point was about the scene where he gives up, where he lets his
Thank you, Jordan. Yeah. Thank you, Jordan. Yes, Paul, do you have thoughts on that? I'll just say for myself that was the moment in the movie where I was already prepared for this because of Paul's introduction, but that was the moment to me where I said, okay, this isn't a movie where Chris Evans is going to be Captain America.
That's right. Because Captain America would have found a way to save everybody, right? And in those movies, that's great too. Chris Evans is perfect as Captain America. But this is a film that makes you think you're following Captain America only to find out you're following an ordinary, flawed human being. And when he has to let his young comrade go, it's already painful enough, right? Because clearly they're friends. Clearly that young guy admires him, although it makes Curtis uncomfortable. But Curtis never forgets the larger mission, right? Which is we have to keep pressing forward on the train. We're going to need Mason if we're going to make that headway. We're going to need an important hostage. And this is the kind of sacrifice that I am going to make and that I hope my young friend understands had to be made. When you find out later that Curtis had the opportunity to eat that young man when he was a child, you see how much more layered the guilt is even than we thought. And that's one of the more powerful and beautiful things, again, about his performance. One person asked in the chat, and it's maybe somewhat relevant to the discussion here, why would Wilford want to give up his power to Curtis? Not typical of an autocrat. And I think it's as simple as the fact that he's burned out. I alluded to this earlier. He's kind of done playing the God Emperor of the train, and he's happy to have someone else take over, and he'll continue eating his steaks. So I don't think it's any reason, having to do with particular admiration for Curtis, other than the fact that Curtis is the type of, strong, chiseled jaw type of, strong man that he would admire. Andrew mentioned this, right? He's deemed fit and suitable in a way that others on the train are not. And so he's being groomed. He doesn't realize he's been being groomed all along by both Gilliam and Wilford to take on that role. There was a second part, though. The second part had to do, Andrew, do you recall?
Yeah, there was the point about Ed Harris sort of being like the man behind the curtain in The Wizard of Oz, which,
and someone else mentioned in the chat his role in The Truman Show, where he is the director of, Truman's life.
Right. Just like he's the conductor of the lives of all the people on the train.
Yeah.
And I find it completely believable that he would. Well, first I want to say, that you could imagine that Curtis's willingness to let the Jamie Bell character go to die in the cause of advancing their larger goal probably only made Wilford feel more sure that he was the right sort of choice to take over for him, because that sacrifice was a drop in the bucket compared to the sacrifices he perceives himself and the person who is the conductor or the engineer having to make. So I would also say that, everything everyone said about Wilford's willingness to give up his role, I think makes total sense, but also it's about legacy, right? And if he doesn't pick a successor and train a successor, that train's going to go off the rails, and the train that bears his name, and that would be the lasting tribute to him, would be no more. So I'm not at all surprised that he would do that. Let me see here. Robert, you had another question or comment?
Well, thanks a lot. No one has spoken at all about that Korean guy and his daughter who were in the drawers, and they opened up the drawers, and then, it seems to me that he's the whole hero of this film, and he's Korean, he's not white. He's the one who was saying that he was addicted to this substance whose name I can't remember right now.
Chrono.
What?
Chrono.
Chrono?
Yeah.
But in the end, he was purposely hoarding this chronol because he knew he could make a bomb that would eventually be able to blow open a door. And it was his planning and execution, and he died, of course, but his daughter lived, but he died in the process. But that's the only person. He's the hero, in my opinion, because he stopped this train. He stopped this madness. And no one has even talked about him at all. Am I missing something?
So let's talk about him. The performance there by Song Kang-ho is great, and some people in the chat are recognizing, right, that he is the father of the Kim family in Parasite. Just a terrific actor. And I would agree, he turns out to be, right, we don't know this early on, but he turns out to be our co-protagonist, if you will. And someone who butts heads with Curtis up to the bitter end. You're absolutely right. We think he's a drug addict only, and it does seem there's some addiction at play there with the Cronol, which we find out is really just industrial waste. So things are really bad when even your drugs are basically going to kill you much more quickly than any other drug. But at any rate, we find out he's not simply an addict. He is hoarding all that stuff because it can be used as an explosive. And the fundamental difference between him and Curtis, and maybe between him and everybody else on that train, is I think you're right, that he wants off the train. You know, there's got to be a better way than this, maybe even a better way to die than living on this train. And he believes, based on the incident, right, where they're shooting across the overpass or whatever, right? The Franco guy is trying to kill Chris Evans. You know, they're shooting each other across quite a distance and breaking the windows of the train, right? That's when the Korean character notices the snowflake and is convinced more than ever that the snow is going to melt at some point, because he sees the plane that he's seen passing by before. In the past, he could only see the tail, and now he can see more of the whole plane. And so he's convinced we've got to go out. There may be a fighting chance. The existence of that polar bear, by the way, is confirmation that something can live out there.
Exactly.
So if they can live out there, we can live out there. It's not going to be easy, but we have to try. And you're right. He's the one who says, you know, this whole society we've created on this train is twisted and wrong, no matter who's running it. It wouldn't matter if Curtis was running it. We have to get the hell out of here. And of course he doesn't. His daughter does.
And then that's why he's the true revolutionary. And guess what? He's cast as a Korean guy. He's a non-white as well.
That's right. And he's someone who comes to us as a stealth protagonist, right? Because at first,
right,
he seems like a minor character, or just someone to help us open the doors, or someone who frankly is in the way. And he turns out to be so much more than that. And by design, we find out that that's what he's been doing the whole time. He has a plan. He just needed to get out of that drawer.
Exactly, Paul. You've captured it brilliantly. It's just brilliant. And I just think that's the key to the whole movie, really.
I love him. He's a great actor too. He really is.
Thanks, Robert. The other thing I would say is that I think that he represents, someone who's not willing to accept the sort of already agreed upon terms of the debate, right? He basically thinks that Curtis is asking the wrong question, which isn't how can we make things on the train better? How can we get control of this train? He's saying, why do we even have to accept that we should have to be on this train at all? Mm-hmm. Right? And one of the things that Paul brought up in the chat is basically, this movie doesn't offer any sort of indication of hope or growth on the part of the people in the front of the train. And if we can assume that Bong assumed that many of the people who would see this movie would be the sort of people he's depicting on the front of the train, then what, is this movie only supposed to plant a seed of guilt? It shows that there's no room for growth, or that there's hopelessness. And I think one of the main takeaways from the film is that don't accept the terms of the debate that everybody else has agreed to, because that might not really be the only solution, or the answer to that may not be the only solution, or that may not be the only question, or even the most important question to ask. And if you think about that, the potential of that lesson, of the film teaching that lesson, whether it has to do with differences between races or classes, or the issues of the environment, it really opens up a whole interesting new potential line of thought.
If I could piggyback on what you're saying there, Andrew, to say
Sure.
something I meant to say in the video and I didn't have time for. You're absolutely right. You know, reframing the debate that has basically led everyone to disaster is a key theme in the film. And it also is implicit in how we respond to Tilda Swinton's speech early on about the shoe. You know, be the shoe, understand your preordained order in the system of all things, accept this as a kind of religious truth, right? It's not even just a political truth. They treat Wilford and the train like an article of faith. And two of the sources for that kind of speech, that kind of thinking where you tell everybody just accept things as they are, accept your role, accept the terms of the debate. I don't know if this is a source that Bong Joon-ho knew or not. I don't presume. But if you go back to the ancient Greeks, if you go to Aesop, if you go to Plutarch, if you go to Livy and his History of the Romans, and then Shakespeare borrowing from Livy in plays like Coriolanus and Julius Caesar and all the rest, there's this famous old story about the belly and the rest of the members of the body. And the members of the body rebel against the belly and say, why don't you feed us more? Why do you get all the food first? And this actually gets played in Shakespeare's play as a debate between the plebeians of Rome who are starving to death and this Senator Menenius, who says to them, you know, the Senate of Rome is the belly, and we get all the nutrients so that we can disperse those nutrients to the rest of the body. So stop trying to be a belly. You're not in charge. You're a toe, you're a foot, you're an arm, you're whatever. Exactly what Tilda Swinton said to these people on the train. She just uses the shoe instead of a foot. And the other thing to have in the back of your mind perhaps here is in the Christian tradition, which is when St. Paul gets to these same ideas in the letter to the Corinthians. He talks about the church being the body of Christ. We're all part of the body, and every member of the body is equally important. So if you try to rebel and say you're not part of the body because you're a hand and not a foot, you're missing the point. You're still part of the same body. So from the Roman and Greek tradition all the way to the Christian tradition, you have this debate, right, about what the natural order of things is among human beings in terms of social class. And this film, you know, challenges you to think outside of that. And the Korean character is also Nam, right? He is also trying to think out of the terms of the existing debate, as Andrew pointed out.
Yeah, we all, it's hard to put oneself in a frame of mind or to imagine an existence dramatically different from one's own in many regards. And, you know, I've been fortunate enough in my life to, you know, work at and learn at institutions where I have been taught by or been classmates with a wide range of people. And one of the things I learned from that experience is that there were things in my life that were never said to me. They were simply expectations. I'll make a very clear one, simple one. I'm going to go to college. My family, our you know, our fortunate place, the means my parents had, their expectations for me, etc. I was going to go to college. It was never sort of mentioned as something I needed to strive for. The expectation was I would develop in such a way where I would always have the option, and it was the expectation that I would eventually at some point go on to education beyond high school. But it was never sort of, I don't remember it ever being sort of said to me as something I needed to, and told you're at that age where you're actually sending applications, that it was something I needed to focus on. And at college, I met people whose families also never said to them, you need to think about later on in your life when you're going to go to college. But it wasn't because it was expected that they would go, it was because it was assumed that they never would. Mm-hmm. And we can't, it's hard many times to imagine the damage that can be done by not suggesting an opportunity or not letting people know an option exists, and the damage that can be done by telling people that something is completely out of the question. If you're not don't come from a place where those things were said to you or not said to you. Now, you know, it was also never said to me that there were lots of things that were never said to me that were never possibilities for me, but they were genuinely never possibilities for me, like being a professional athlete. Never, never a possibility, never offered to me. I don't have a complaint about that. But these other things that are opportunities that could be available to people and that they're not presented as options and that people won't know about them until they are presented, that it's the potential for good by saying these things and the potential harm by completely ignoring these things is really staggering. And that's, to me, that was one of the things I thought about while watching the film, those sort of implicit lessons of this movie and the harm in telling people. You may say to yourself, well, why should they listen to Tilda Swinton? Why should they listen to her? That they should all stay shoes, right? But if that world in particular, and this is one of the great things about allegory and about science fiction, about dystopia, the depiction of that world in that film made it clear that those people weren't going to be presented with other options, and that everything about their existence reinforced that lesson that Tilda Swinton was trying to teach them or remind them of.
I think that's so right. And Robert's suggesting in his chat comment that we live in a similar kind of society even now. It's not just the stuff of dystopian science fiction, perhaps not as inelegantly as Tilda Swinton's character, but nonetheless, a lot of people are told to be a shoe in our society and to enjoy it and to like it. And we crush what Andrew was talking about, which is the power of aspiration, the power to just imagine a different way of doing things or a different way of being, a different vocation. And to the extent that we stifle that in people, you know, we're committing the same kind of mistakes that the leaders of that train are committing. We do it every day in, you know, not broadening people's horizons, but curtailing them.
True. Thank you very much, Paul. Thank you, everybody, for joining us for this discussion. We have a lot more planned in the coming weeks. We have a number of our Tuesday night seminars coming up, including one. I hope Paul's references to the wisdom and great artfulness of Shakespeare might inspire you to sign up for our seminar next week on different film iterations of Macbeth. We also have coming up 2 different seminars on the wonderful career of Fritz Lang, that director of Metropolis, who was mentioned earlier. All these plugs in our discussion that nobody planned. How wonderful. And Gary Kramer is going to be joining us again for a seminar on short films that he sees at festivals all over the country. And he's got a great knack for demonstrating the power of that format that most of us don't see nearly enough of. And in addition, the Fritz Lang 2, his work in Hollywood later on in the spring, and then I will be talking about the Oscars, an unusual year, to be sure, for all of us, and the Oscars are no exception, and I'll be talking a bit about that, as well as the history of the awards and the institution that puts them on as well. If you happened upon us through a Google search or something like that, I would encourage you to visit brynmarfilm.org and sign up for our emails. Every Thursday, we send out our education email that lets you know what the film is going to be discussed the following Monday, and has a link to the introduction. They're not all quite as wonderful as Paul's was this week, but they're all very good, I have to say. And they all help make the viewing of the film and our discussion on Monday all the more fruitful. And if you are able to support Bryn Mawr Film Institute as we work to reopen, some of you may have received an email, in fact, today that we are now open for theater rentals, and we are preparing ourselves to open for more conventional movie going as well before too long. But until we can do all those things, please consider supporting the Film Institute with a donation to whatever extent you might be able to. Thank you all so much for joining us. Paul, thank you as always for joining
Thank
us.
you.
And
Thanks, everybody.
look forward to seeing everybody again soon. Thank you.
Take care.